My name is James Lopez. I'm 31 years old, and I used to be a park ranger before I shifted to city planning. I've always been the type to keep a level head under pressure, but that weekend in Ocala National Forest changed the way I see the world and myself forever. It's hard to explain what we encountered without sounding insane, but I'll do my best. This happened in April 2012. My girlfriend Emma, two friends Tyler and Kelly, and I decided to take an RV trip into the heart of Ocala. Emma, 30, has always been an avid nature enthusiast, and the plan of the group was that she'd been itching to show us Alexander Springs, where the water is crystal clear and the trails promise adventure. Tyler, 28, my childhood friend, and Kelly, his girlfriend, were tagging along mostly because they loved camping, though Kelly was more into the safety of RV life than the rugged outdoors. Looking back, I wish I trusted Kelly's unease from the start. We arrived at our campsite around mid-afternoon on a Friday, excited to leave behind the noise of the city. The RV, which I'd borrowed from my brother, was parked in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air smelled fresh, the kind of scent you can only get deep in the woods. We unpacked quickly. Tents for Tyler and Kelly, and Emma and I would use the RV. "See? Perfect," Tyler said, slapping me on the back. "We needed this, man. Get the old crew together." Emma was already wandering the edge of the woods with her camera. "The biodiversity here is incredible," she called back, her voice tinged with excitement. "It's so quiet, though." It was quiet, eerily so. Usually you'd hear birds chirping, insects buzzing, something. Instead, the forest felt like it was holding its breath. I chalked it up to being farther out than usual. That first night was uneventful. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and told the same dumb stories Tyler and I had been recycling since we were teenagers. Kelly, however, seemed uncomfortable. She kept glancing over her shoulder and leaning closer to Tyler. "What's up?" I asked her. "Nothing," she muttered. It's so dark out here." "It's the woods, Kel," Tyler said with a grin. "It's supposed to be dark." We laughed it off and went to bed. I didn't know it then, but the forest had already started watching us. The next morning, Emma convinced us to hike a nearby trail. She was thrilled to explore, and I figured it'd be good to stretch our legs. Kelly was reluctant, but joined anyway. We hadn't gone far when Emma froze. She pointed at the ground, a single footprint, barefoot and large. But it wasn't just big. The toes were elongated, tipped with what looked like claw marks. "Bear?" Tyler guessed. "No," Emma said, crouching. "Bears don't leave prints like this." Kelly took a step back. "Let's just go back. This feels wrong." "Relax," Tyler said, brushing it off. "It's probably some weird hiker. People are strange out here." Emma shot me a glance, her brows knitted. I nodded for her to keep walking. The hike became more unsettling the farther we went. The quieter the woods got, the occasional snapping of twigs sounding deliberate, like something was following us. Kelly kept muttering that she wanted to turn around, and even Tyler's usual cockiness began to falter. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. By the time we got back to camp, everyone was tense. We decided to stick close to the RV for the evening. As I gathered firewood near the edge of the clearing, I heard Emma calling my name. "James!" It was distant, coming from deeper in the woods. I frowned. Emma had been by the fire a minute ago. "James, come here!" The voice was louder now, insistent. My gut told me something was off, but curiosity won out. I stepped into the tree line. "Emma?" I called. The voice stopped. I turned back toward camp and nearly collided with Emma herself. "Where were you going?" she asked, breathless. "I heard you," I said, shaken. "You were calling me." Her face went pale. I didn't say anything. That night, things got worse. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of movement outside the RV, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching the pine needles. I nudged Emma awake and whispered for her to stay quiet. Peering through the curtain, I spotted a figure near the fire pit. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, and its posture was bent as though it had been broken and pieced back together. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, heart hammering. "Who's there?" I barked. The figure turned to look at me, and I swear it smiled. Not a friendly smile, but a wide, unnatural grin that made my stomach churn. Before I could react, it darted into the woods with an animalistic speed. leaving no trace. The next morning, we found deep claw marks on the side of the RV and the smoldering remains of our firewood scattered around. Tyler laughed nervously. Okay, so someone's messing with us. Someone? Emma shot back. You think a person did that? It's probably a prank, Tyler insisted. Locals messing with tourists. Kelly wasn't convinced. This isn't normal, Tyler. That thing last night wasn't human. Emma spoke up. There's a Navajo legend about skinwalkers, shapeshifters that take the form of animals or people to deceive you. They can mimic voices, even faces. This isn't the Southwest, Tyler scoffed. That's a desert legend. Legends travel, Emma snapped, and whatever it is, it's here. The argument spiraled until I stepped in. Enough, we're leaving. Pack up and let's go. As we scrambled to break camp, the forest closed in. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of branches far too close for comfort. Kelly stayed by the RV, clutching her arms as if shielding herself from something unseen. Then we heard it, Tyler's voice calling from the woods. Guys, I found something. Come check it out. We froze. Tyler was right next to me, his face draining of color. Stay here, I said, grabbing a flashlight and stepping into the trees. Tyler followed, despite my protests. The deeper we went, the darker it became. Then we saw it, a figure standing between the pines, its back to us. It looked just like Tyler. Hey, I shouted. The figure turned, its face a twisted, grotesque mockery of Tyler's features. Its eyes were too large, its mouth stretched too wide. Before we could react, it let out a guttural, inhuman screech and charged. We bolted back to camp, adrenaline pumping. We're leaving now, I shouted. Everyone piled into the RV as I started the engine. The tires spun in the loose dirt before catching, and we sped down the forest road. But the thing didn't stop. It ran alongside us, its limbs moving in unnatural jerks. Its mouth formed words that weren't quite right. James, it mimicked, its voice distorted. Don't leave. Emma screamed as it slammed against the side of the RV, claws screeching against the metal. Tyler grabbed a hatchet from the supplies and swung wildly at the window, shattering the glass and forcing the creature to fall back. We didn't stop until we reached a ranger station at the edge of the forest, shaking and covered in scratches from the shattered glass. The ranger took one look at us. Around Alexander Springs? He asked. We nodded. He sighed. You're lucky you made it out. We never talked about that trip again. Tyler and I drifted apart after that, and Kelly refused to camp ever again. Emma became obsessed with the legends, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. As for me, I haven't set foot in the woods since. Some places are wild not because of the animals or terrain, but because something else lives there, something that watches, waits, and hungers. My name is Grayson Morris, and I'm 41 years old. This happened in late October during a weekend camping trip to Falling Water State Park in Florida. I was there with my wife, Linda, our 10-year-old daughter, Sarah, and our 7-year-old son, Joey. What started as an ordinary family trip turned into something I'll never forget. Though sometimes I wish I could. We had planned the trip as a way to disconnect from screens and reconnect as a family. I wanted to teach my kids a bit about survival skills, maybe show them how to start a fire or identify edible plants. Linda was on board, even though she had her reservations about the old RV I insisted on driving. It had its quirks, flickering lights, and an engine that sometimes took a few tries to start, but I was confident it would get us through. When we arrived at Falling Water State Park, the sun was just beginning to set. The golden light filtered through the tall pine trees, and the sound of distant birdsong filled the air. The kids were already squabbling over who got which bunk bed in the RV, and Linda sighed as she unpacked a cooler full of sandwiches and snacks. This is going to be good for us, I said, giving her a reassuring smile. Fresh air, family bonding, it's what we need. She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the dense woods surrounding our campsite. Sure, as long as nothing breaks down. That evening, we gathered around a small fire I built. Joey poked at the flames with a stick, and Sarah was off to the side, scribbling in a notebook she brought along for stories. She had a vivid imagination, always making up tales about fairies and witches. Linda read a book, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the firelight. "What are you writing about, kiddo?" I asked Sarah. She looked up and smiled. "A friend I met today." My heart sank for a moment, thinking she might have wandered off and spoken to a stranger. "What friend?" "Ellie," she said matter-of-factly. "She lives by the waterfall." I exchanged a glance with Linda. "You didn't go off alone, did you?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I didn't meet her in person. She just started talking to me when we got here." Linda frowned. "Honey, it's okay to have an imaginary friend, but don't scare your dad like that." Sarah's expression darkened. "She's not imaginary." I didn't push it. Kids have wild imaginations, and I figured it was just part of her storytelling hobby. The first truly strange thing happened later that night. I was outside stoking the fire one last time before bed when I heard it, faint laughter coming from the woods. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I stood still, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. "Kids?" I called, but they were already inside the RV with Linda. The laughter faded, and I told myself it was probably another camper. Still, it put me on edge. The next morning, Linda complained about a cold draft in the RV. "It's like someone left the door open," she said, pulling her cardigan tighter. I checked the door and the windows. Everything was locked up tight. We spent the day hiking to the park's main attraction, the waterfall. Sarah was unusually quiet, lagging behind and glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. Joey, on the other hand, was full of energy, running ahead and shouting, "Come on, slow pokes!" The trail led us to the waterfall, a beautiful cascade of water tumbling into a deep sinkhole. As we admired the view, Sarah tugged on my sleeve. "Ellie says this is where it happened," she whispered. "Where what happened?" I asked, my voice low. Sarah didn't answer. She just stared at the water. That night, the strangeness grew worse. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of faint knocking on the RV door. My first thought was that it was Joey playing a prank, but when I checked, both kids were asleep in their bunks. The knocking came again, this time from the back of the RV. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold night air. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone around, except for a single pair of child-sized muddy prints leading toward the woods. The next morning, Sarah seemed withdrawn, and Joey complained about bad dreams. Linda pulled me aside. "Something's not right here, Grayson," she said. "The kids aren't acting like themselves." I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too, a heaviness in the air, a sense that we weren't alone. By the third day, things reached a breaking point. Sarah began talking to Ellie out loud, carrying on conversations as if the girl were standing right beside her. When Linda tried to intervene, Sarah shouted, "You're scaring her! She doesn't like it when you yell!" That night, I woke to the sound of the RV door creaking open. Sarah was gone. Panic surged through me as I grabbed a flashlight and followed her tiny footprints into the woods. I found her standing by the waterfall, her arms outstretched as if reaching for something. A faint figure stood in front of her, a young girl, soaking wet, her hair hanging in tangled strands over her pale face. "Sarah!" I shouted. The figure turned toward me, and I froze. Her eyes were hollow black pits, and her mouth twisted into a scream that echoed through the woods. Linda arrived moments later, clutching Joey's hand. Together we pulled Sarah away from the water. The ghost didn't follow, but her presence lingered, oppressive and cold. Back in the RV, we tried to make sense of what was happening. Sarah, still dazed, murmured, "She's so lonely. She just wants someone to stay with her." I remembered the muddy footprints, the laughter, the feeling of being watched. "She's dangerous," I said. "We need to leave now." But the RV wouldn't start. The lights flickered and the air grew colder. A loud bang came from the roof, followed by the sound of scraping metal. Linda clutched my arm. "What does she want?" "She wants Sarah," I said, my voice trembling. Linda suggested offering Ellie something to appease her. Sarah hesitated, then handed over a doll she'd brought along. "Ellie can have this," she said, "so she won't be lonely anymore." We left the doll at the base of the waterfall, whispering a prayer for Ellie to find peace. For a moment, the woods fell silent, and I thought it was over. As we drove away, the RV finally roaring to life, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw Ellie standing at the edge of the woods, clutching the doll. Then she was gone. The kids were quieter on the ride home, and Linda seemed lost in thought. We didn't talk about what happened, not right away, but every now and then I catch Sarah staring out the window as if listening to someone I can't hear. And sometimes, when the house is quiet at night, I hear faint laughter just beyond the edge of the light. My name is Jacob Mosby, and I'm 36 years old. I work as a freelance photographer, traveling around the country in my RV to capture landscapes and abandoned places. This story happened about a month ago when I was camping in Big Shoals State Park, Florida, near the Suwannee River. What I experienced there changed the way I see the world and the things that might linger in the spaces we think are empty. The drive to Big Shoals was peaceful, the kind of slow winding road I've come to love. My RV, a dependable second-hand model, hummed along as I navigated through towering oaks and pines. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth. I had planned to spend 3 days exploring the park, capturing the rushing rapids of the Suwannee River and the limestone cliffs that lined its banks. When I arrived, the visitor center was empty, except for a ranger named David. He looked up from his desk as I walked in, his face weathered but kind. "Afternoon," he said. "You here for the trails or camping?" "Both," I replied. "I'm a photographer, thought I'd get some shots of the river." David frowned slightly. "Just be careful around the water. It's beautiful but unpredictable, and don't camp too close to it." "Why not?" I asked, curious. He shrugged. "Currents can be dangerous, and people say strange things happen out there. I've heard about voices, kids playing near the river, stuff like that." I chuckled. "Ghost stories." "Call it what you want," he said, his tone serious. "But don't ignore the signs. Stay safe." I thanked him and left, dismissing his warnings as part of the park folklore. Still, his words lingered as I drove to the campsite. I set up my RV near a clearing, a short walk from the Suwannee River. The late afternoon sun glinted off the water, and the sound of the rushing rapids was hypnotic. I spent the first few hours walking along the trails, snapping shots of the limestone bluffs and the towering cypress trees. The place was stunning. Things took a turn that evening when my drone malfunctioned. I had been flying it over the river to capture aerial shots when it suddenly veered off course and crashed into the trees. Muttering curses, I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the woods to retrieve it. The forest was darker than I had expected, the dense canopy swallowing the light. I found the drone near the riverbank, but as I bent to pick it up, I noticed something strange. Small handprints in the mud, like those of children. They were fresh too, leading toward the water. I scanned the area with my flashlight. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The only sound was the rushing water. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I shook it off. Kids must have been playing here earlier, I told myself. Still, I hurried back to my RV, uneasy. That night, as I reviewed the photos on my laptop, I noticed something odd in one of the shots of the river. There were faint figures in the background, small pale shapes that resembled children. I zoomed in, but the resolution wasn't clear enough to make out details. It's just a trick of the light, I thought, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of laughter. It was faint, distant, but unmistakably that of children. Groggy, I peered out the RV's window, but saw nothing except the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the river. The laughter came again, closer this time. My chest tightened as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. "Hello? Who's out there?" The laughter stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood frozen, my flashlight beam scanning the tree line. Finally, I retreated to the RV and locked the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I decided to shake off the weirdness and focus on my work. I hiked along the trails, capturing the beauty of the park, but the unease grew. The forest seemed quieter than it should be. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps. As I neared the river, I saw him, a boy standing on the opposite bank. He looked about 8 years old, with pale skin and clothes that seemed out of place, like something from the 19th century. He didn't move, just stared at me. "Hey," I called out. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy raised his hand and pointed downstream. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to follow him, but something about the way he moved, silent and smooth, like he wasn't quite real, kept me rooted to the spot. That night the sounds returned. Laughter, splashing, and faint voices echoed through the forest. At one point I heard a girl's voice calling my name. "Jacob," she whispered. "Come play with us." My blood turned cold. I checked the windows, but the outside was dark. Then I heard footsteps, tiny pattering steps, circling the RV. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by a low rushing sound like wind through the trees, but the air was still. Then I saw them, 3 children standing near the edge of the clearing. Their eyes hollow and their skin pale and translucent. They didn't speak, just stared, their heads tilted slightly, as if curious. One of them, a girl with long tangled hair, took a step toward me. Panicking, I slammed the door shut and locked it. The children vanished, but the sound of their laughter echoed in my ears long after they were gone. By the next day, I was ready to leave. But when I turned the key in the RV's ignition, nothing happened. The battery was dead. Frustrated, I grabbed my camera and decided to take one last walk to the river before finding help. When I reached the bank, the children were waiting for me. This time they were closer, their forms more solid. The boy from before stepped forward. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. I'm taking photos," I stammered. "I didn't mean to disturb anything." "You're in our place," the girl said, her hollow eyes boring into mine. "Stay with us." I shook my head. "I can't." The children exchanged looks, then reached out their hands. The air around me grew colder, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "You can't leave," the boy said. "No one leaves." Desperate, I pulled out my camera. "Look," I said, showing them a photo of the river with their faint silhouettes. "You're here. People will know your story. You won't be forgotten." "Forgotten?" The children hesitated. The cold air eased slightly, and their forms flickered, as if caught between this world and the next. "Promise," the girl whispered. "I promise," I said, my voice trembling. The children faded, their laughter echoing softly as they disappeared. The forest grew quiet again, but the air felt lighter, less oppressive. When I returned to the RV, the engine started on the first try. I didn't question it. I just drove back. At the visitor center, I told David what had happened. He listened, his face grave, but didn't say much. As I left, he muttered, "You're lucky they let you go." I wrote an article about the lost children of Big Shoals, sharing their story alongside my photos of the hauntingly beautiful river. None of the ghostly silhouettes appeared in the published images, but I didn't care. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I wouldn't go back. My name is Emily Knight, and I'm 31 years old. What I'm about to share happened just 2 months ago during a camping trip in Tate's Hell State Forest in Florida. I used to laugh at ghost stories and legends. Now I'm not so sure. It was my idea to go. I'd read about the forest's creepy history, stories of people vanishing, strange curses, and the infamous final words of C.B. Tate. My name is C.B. Tate, and I've been to hell. It seemed perfect for an adventurous weekend with my closest friends. There were 4 of us. Danny, my best friend since high school, level-headed and sarcastic at 30. Melissa, quiet and jumpy but sweet, tagged along reluctantly. And Cody, a guy I'd known for years but never fully trusted. He was brash, competitive, and had a habit of stirring up trouble. I suspected he had a crush on me, which only made things awkward. We took my RV, an old but functional beast, and parked it deep in the forest. The swampy smell of the air and the dense canopy of twisted trees added to the eerie vibe. Perfect, I thought. We set up near a clearing surrounded by cypress trees. Danny got the fire going, and Melissa unpacked supplies while Cody cracked jokes about the forest's name, Tate's Hell. He said with a smirk, "Probably just an old drunk who got lost and died." "Yeah," Danny shot back. "So maybe keep your jokes down, Cody. Don't want to piss off the ghosts." Melissa shivered and muttered, "Can we not talk about ghosts?" I laughed, trying to ease the tension. Relax, guys. It's just a forest. What's the worst that could happen? That night, the first sign of something wrong came when the generator started acting up. We had just finished eating when the RV's lights flickered and then went out. The only light came from the fire, casting long, dancing shadows across the trees. "I'll check it," Danny said, grabbing a flashlight. He came back a few minutes later looking puzzled. "Everything's fine with the generator. It just stopped. I don't get it." Cody snorted. "Probably a squirrel chewed a wire. No big deal." But I noticed Melissa staring into the trees, clutching her jacket. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" I asked. It sounded like whispering, like someone saying my name. We all went quiet. I didn't hear anything, but the air felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. The next day we decided to hike a nearby trail. I brought an old map I found online, but it quickly became clear it was outdated. Trails branched off in confusing directions and landmarks didn't match up. We wandered for hours before stumbling across something unsettling. It was a small clearing with a crude shrine made of sticks and bones. Animal skulls hung from the trees, and strange symbols were carved into the dirt. Melissa refused to go near it. "Probably just a hunter's prank," Cody said, poking at the bones with a stick. "Don't touch it!" Melissa snapped, surprising everyone. "It's not a prank. This feels wrong." I told Cody to leave it alone, and we moved on, but the tension was thick, and even Danny looked uneasy. Back at camp, the generator failed again. The map I'd left on the picnic table was gone, as if the wind had taken it, but the air was still. That night, the whispering started. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it clearly, someone saying my name, faint but unmistakable. "Danny," I hissed, shaking his arm. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" he said groggily. Before I could answer, we heard it again, a high-pitched scream, far away but chilling. Melissa started crying. "It's just an animal," Cody said, though his voice shook. But it wasn't just an animal. I was sure of it. The next morning, Melissa refused to leave the RV. She said she'd seen something in the woods the night before. A pale woman with hollow eyes watching us from the shadows. "You were dreaming," Cody said dismissively. "You've been spooked since we got here." "No," Melissa said firmly. "I wasn't dreaming. She was real." I wanted to believe Cody was right, but the way Melissa said it sent a shiver down my spine. Still, we decided to stay. I didn't want to give up on the trip because of some creepy noises. That evening, Melissa vanished. We were sitting by the fire when she suddenly stood up and walked toward the swamp. "I'll be back," she said, her voice flat. "Melissa," I called after her. She didn't turn around. Danny and I followed her flashlight beam, but it stopped abruptly near the edge of the swamp. The mud was churned up, and her shoe lay half buried. There was no sign of her. Panic set in. We shouted her name, but the only response was the croaking of frogs and the rustle of leaves. Then Danny found the altar. It was larger than the one we'd seen before, surrounded by bones and rotting wood. Symbols were etched into the mud, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The air reeked of decay. "This is wrong," Danny said. "We have to leave now." As we made our way back to the RV, the forest came alive. Shadows darted between the trees, and the whispers turned into voices, mocking, taunting, calling our names. Then we saw her, the witch. She was pale, gaunt, with stringy black hair and hollow eyes that burned with hatred. She stood motionless, watching us, her bony hands outstretched. Cody froze, staring at her in terror. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. Before anyone could answer, the witch let out an ear-piercing scream. The ground beneath us seemed to ripple, and spectral hands reached from the swamp, clawing at our legs. We ran for the RV, but the witch followed. Her twisted form appeared in every shadow, her whispers filling our ears. When we reached the clearing, we found the RV surrounded by grotesque humanoid figures with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. They clawed at the windows, hissing and growling. Danny grabbed a can of lighter fluid and a lighter. "The altar," he said. "We have to destroy it." We ran back to the altar, dodging the figures that seemed to materialize from the swamp. Danny doused the wooden effigies with fluid and lit them on fire. The flames roared to life, and the witch screamed in rage. Her form flickered like a dying candle, But as the altar burned, Cody was dragged into the swamp. He screamed for help, but the spectral hands pulled him under. Then he was gone. The witch vanished, and the forest fell silent. Danny and I stumbled back to the RV, shaking and covered in mud. The generator worked again, and the lights flickered back on. When we reached the ranger station the next day, we reported everything. They didn't believe us, but promised to search for Melissa and Cody. A week later, Melissa's body was found near the altar. Cody was never recovered. I still hear the witch's voice in my dreams, whispering, "This forest is mine. You will never escape me, and I don't think I ever will." My name is Luke Guzman Hunter. I'm 48 years old, a retired high school teacher, and a widower. What I'm about to tell you happened just last month during a solo camping trip off Old King Road in Flagler County, Florida. I thought I was looking for peace and quiet, maybe even a little closure. Instead, I found something I still can't explain, something that might still be out there waiting. I arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The drive down Old King Road was scenic but desolate, with tall oaks draped in Spanish moss and palmetto crowding the edges of the narrow dirt road. My RV, a beaten-up 1994 Winnebago, rattled over every bump, but I was used to it. This wasn't my first trip, but something about the stillness unsettled me. I stopped at a convenience store a few miles before the campsite to grab some firewood and snacks. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, looked up from her magazine as I approached. "Camping out on King Road?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Yeah," I said. "I heard it's quiet out there. Good stargazing." She hesitated. "It's quiet, all right. Just don't wander too far from your RV, and if you hear anything strange, don't go looking for it." I laughed it off, but her words stayed with me as I drove the final stretch to the campsite. The sun was low, and I parked near a pond. The water was dark and still, the air smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. I liked the solitude, at least that's what I told myself. The first sign that something wasn't right came that night. I had a small fire going, and the RV's generator was humming softly. I was sitting by the fire, nursing a cup of instant coffee, when the generator sputtered and died. The sudden silence was jarring. "Damn thing," I muttered, grabbing a flashlight to check it out. Everything looked fine. No loose wires, no obvious problems. When I flipped the switch, it roared back to life as if nothing had happened. I returned to my chair, but the unease lingered. The forest around me felt too quiet, like the wildlife had been holding its breath. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes behind me. I turned, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Probably a raccoon, I thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The pond looked serene in the daylight, its surface reflecting the gray sky. As I circled it, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud. They were large, clawed, and definitely not human. A chill ran down my spine. That's when I saw him, a teenage boy, maybe 15 or 16, standing at the edge of the trees. He was thin, with dirty clothes and wild-ass unkempt hair. His eyes darted nervously as if he didn't want to be seen. "Hey there," I called out. "Are you lost?" The boy flinched, but he didn't run. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. "Do you live out here?" He shook his head. "It's watching you. It watches everyone. You have to leave before it gets dark." Before I could ask more, he turned and bolted into the woods. I considered going after him, but something in his voice, pure, raw fear, stopped me. I returned to the RV, uneasy. That evening, I found a mutilated deer near the edge of the pond. Its body was torn apart, the flesh twisted and shredded as if by massive claws. I've seen animal attacks before, but this was different. It looked deliberate. I decided to stay inside the RV that night. The generator kept cutting out, leaving me in darkness for minutes at a time. Each time the lights flickered back on, I thought I saw movement outside the windows, shadows darting just out of sight. Around midnight, I heard a sound that froze me in place, my late wife's voice. "Gabe," Dana whispered, "come outside." I knew it wasn't real. I'd been dreaming of Dana ever since she passed, but this was different. Her voice was so clear, so close. When it called again, I almost opened the door before catching myself. "No," I whispered, backing away. "You're not real." The whisper stopped, but the RV shuddered violently as if something heavy had slammed into it. I grabbed a kitchen knife and held it tight, my heart racing. The shuddering stopped, leaving me in silence. The next morning I found deep scratches on the RV's door, like claw marks. The boy Ethan appeared again, standing at a distance. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "It's hungry," he said. "It doesn't stop." "What is it?" I demanded, approaching him. "What's out there?" He hesitated, then muttered, "It's old. It was here before us. It feeds on fear, on grief. If you don't leave, it'll take you." I tried to get him to explain, but he ran off again. This time, I followed him. He led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser and the air colder. Finally, we reached a clearing with strange symbols carved into the trunks. Ethan pointed at them. "This keeps it out," he said. "Stay here if you want to live." Before I could ask more, he vanished into the trees. I looked around, my pulse hammering. The forest felt alive, the air thick with an oppressive energy. The whispers started again, louder this time, coming from all directions. I returned to the RV, but the hunger followed. That night, it showed itself. I was sitting by the fire when the forest went silent. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure at the edge of the trees. It was humanoid, but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed yellow, fixed on me. "Dana," it said, its voice distorted and hollow. "Come to me." I stood frozen as it stepped closer. The firelight flickered, and I saw its face, or what was left of it. The flesh was stretched and rotting, its mouth too wide, filled with jagged teeth. I grabbed a can of lighter fluid and dashed it onto the fire pit, igniting a massive flame. The creature recoiled, letting out an unearthly shriek. I ran toward the symbols Ethan had shown me, the hunger chasing me through the trees. The moment I crossed the boundary of the symbols, the hunger stopped. It paced back and forth, hissing and snarling, but unable to cross. I stayed there until dawn, clutching the knife and listening to its guttural growls. When the sun rose, the hunger vanished. I returned to the RV, packed up, and drove away without looking back. I stopped at Maggie's store on the way out. She took one look at me and nodded. "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. "You're lucky," she said. "Most people don't make it out." Later, I tried to find information about Ethan, but no one had seen a boy matching his description in years. Some said he was a ghost, a victim of the hunger long ago. Others claimed he was something else entirely, a guardian of sorts, protecting the living from the forest's darkness. Whatever the truth, I know one thing for certain. The hunger is real, and it's still out there, waiting. My name is Julian Norris. I'm 39 years old, and this happened a few months ago when I decided to take a break from the life I'd been barely holding together. My wife Jenna passed away last year, and the silence of my empty home had become unbearable. I'd always loved music. It's what I taught for years, but after she died, I couldn't bring myself to pick up a guitar. So I bought an RV and decided to travel, hoping to find something, anything, that would help me feel alive again. That's how I ended up at Big Shea State Park in Florida. I'd read about the park's rapids, the largest in the state, and thought their roaring, chaotic beauty might inspire me to compose again. What I didn't know was that the silence I'd been running from would find me there, in the voices of the dead. I pulled into the park just before dusk. The forest was dense and quiet, save for the distant roar of the rapids. The ranger station was empty, but I found a map pinned to the bulletin board outside. It marked a few trails and campsites, one of which was near the riverbank. That's where I decided to stay. As I set up my RV, a ranger approached, a woman in her 30s wearing the usual khaki uniform and a wide-brimmed hat. Her name tag read Laura. "Camping alone?" she asked, her tone polite but laced with concern. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just needed some peace and quiet." Laura nodded but hesitated. "The rapids can be unpredictable. Be careful if you hike near the water." She paused, glancing toward the tree line. "Some people say you can hear voices out there at night. Probably just the water playing tricks, but it can be unsettling if you're not used to it." I smiled, more amused than unnerved. Thanks for the warning. Laura didn't return the smile. Just don't wander too far. With that, she left, her words hanging in the cool evening air. After dinner, I sat outside the RV with my guitar, strumming idly as the last light faded from the sky. The sound of the rapids was louder now, a constant rush that drowned out the usual nighttime symphony of crickets and frogs. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of inspiration. Maybe this trip wasn't such a bad idea. Then I heard it, a faint giggle like a child's carried on the wind. I froze, my fingers stilling on the strings. It was faint, almost drowned out by the river, but unmistakable. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there. Hello? I called, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No answer, just the river and the faint rustle of leaves. I told myself it was nothing, just an echo or my imagination playing tricks, and went inside to sleep. That night I dreamed of Jenna. She was standing by the river, her back to me, humming the lullaby she used to sing when we were younger. I tried to call out to her, but no sound came from my lips. When I woke, my cheeks were wet with tears. The next morning I decided to hike one of the trails that wound along the river. The air was crisp, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden streaks. But the unease from the night before lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway down the trail, I noticed something odd, small footprints in the mud, too small to belong to an adult. They ran alongside my own for a few steps before veering off toward the river. There were no other campers around, and the sight sent a chill down my spine. As I followed the trail, the roar of the rapids grew louder, almost deafening. Then I heard it again, a child's laughter, clear and sharp, cutting through the noise. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. Who's there? I called again. No answer. Shaking my head, I pressed on, determined to reach the riverbank. When I got there, I found something even stranger, a small, moss-covered doll lying on the rocks. Its face was faded and weathered, but its eyes seemed to glint in the sunlight, almost as if they were watching me. I picked it up, examining it closely. As I turned it over, a faint melody began to play, a music box tune, soft and haunting. My breath caught in my throat. The tune was the same lullaby Jenna used to hum. That evening I couldn't shake the melody from my head. It felt like the forest was closing in, the shadows growing longer, the air heavier. As I sat in the RV, the music box tune began to play again, faint at first, then louder. I searched the RV, convinced I'd accidentally brought the doll inside, but it wasn't there. The tune stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft knock at the door. I froze. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle and yanked the door open. No one was there, just the empty forest bathed in moonlight. Then I saw them, shadows flitting between the trees. They were small, childlike, moving too quickly to be human. My stomach churned as I realized they were circling the RV. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The RV began to shake as if something, or many somethings, were pounding on the sides. I shouted for them to stop, but the noise only grew louder, the whispers and laughter blending into a chaotic cacophony. Finally, I grabbed my guitar and strummed the first chords that came to mind, playing louder and louder until the shaking stopped. The laughter faded, leaving only the sound of my music and the distant roar of the rapids. The next morning, I knew I had to leave, but something drew me back to the river. I followed the trail again, clutching the doll I'd found. The voices were louder now, calling my name, singing the lullaby in eerie childlike tones. When I reached the riverbank, the air grew icy, and the shadows beneath the trees seemed to ripple like water. "I know you're here," I said, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The voices grew louder, and the shadows took shape. 3 children, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark voids. They stared at me, their expressions a mix of sadness and anger. "Help us," they whispered, their voices overlapping in a haunting harmony. "What do you need?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. They pointed to the doll, and in that moment, I understood. They were tied to it, bound to the river by whatever tragedy had claimed them. I placed the doll on the ground and stepped back, watching as the children reached for it. But as their hands touched it, their forms began to twist and contort, their whispers turning to wails. The river surged, the rapids crashing violently, and the shadows rushed toward me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the rocks, and ran as fast as I could, the screams echoing in my ears. I left Big Shays that day, vowing never to return. The doll stayed by the river, but the memory of those voices has haunted me ever since. I tried to write about it, to turn it into a piece of music, but every time I play, I hear their whispers in the background. A week after I got home, I found the doll on my porch. Its music box was broken, but sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear it playing. My name is Logan Carter, and I'm 34 years old. What I'm about to tell you isn't some tall tale for clicks or likes. It's the truth, even if I can't prove it. This happened in the summer of last year, deep in the heart of Hockomock Swamp, Massachusetts, a place some people call the heart of the Bridgewater Triangle. I went in as a skeptic, thinking I'd spend a week documenting my survivalist skills for my blog. I came out broken, both physically and mentally, and I'm still not sure if I escaped at all. It started with an idea I'd had for months, test my skills by surviving 7 days alone in one of the most notoriously haunted places in the country. I didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. I thought the stories were just folklore blown out of proportion. So I packed my gear, tent, GPS, water purifier, knives, and my GoPro, and drove to the edge of the swamp. The first thing you notice in Hockomock Swamp is the silence. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just the occasional drip of water and the squelch of mud underfoot. It was oppressive, but I chalked it up to the swamp's natural atmosphere. By late afternoon, I found a clearing to set up camp. As I hammered stakes into the soggy ground, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but there was nothing but dense trees and mist. "Get a grip," I muttered, shaking off the unease. That night, I built a small fire and recorded my first blog entry. I talked about the swamp's history, how the Wampanoag people believed it was a place of great spiritual power, and how locals whispered about strange lights and creatures. As I spoke, the words felt heavier than I expected, like they carried a weight I didn't understand. I fell asleep to the crackling of the fire. When I woke up, the fire was out, and something felt off. As I stepped outside the tent, I froze. Bare footprints surrounded my campsite. They were human-like, but too large, with long, claw-like toes. "Maybe a prank," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. Who would trek this far into the swamp just to mess with me? And why wouldn't I have heard them? I brushed it off, deciding to explore further into the swamp. My GPS flickered in and out, forcing me to rely on a map. Around midday, I stumbled upon something bizarre. A crude shrine made of animal bones and sticks perched on a stone slab. The air around it was colder, almost suffocating. I took a few photos and moved on quickly, feeling an inexplicable dread. That night, as I edited footage by the fire, I noticed my knife was missing. I searched the tent, my backpack, nothing. Finally, I found it stuck in a nearby tree, blade first, as though it had been thrown with precision. My stomach churned. I didn't sleep well. On the third day, my water purifier broke. I cursed under my breath, knowing I'd have to boil water from now on, which would cost me precious time and energy. The swamp seemed to mock me, its stillness amplified by my rising frustration. That night, the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay in my tent, the sounds became distinct. My name, spoken softly over and over. "Logan, Logan, help me." It sounded like my ex-girlfriend's voice, fragile and pleading. My rational mind told me it was a trick of isolation, a manifestation of guilt. But when I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the whispers moved, retreating into the darkness. I didn't follow. On the fourth day, I stumbled upon the shrine again, or at least I thought it was the same one. This time, the bones were arranged differently, and symbols were carved into the trees around it. "What the hell?" I muttered, taking a step back. That's when I saw it, a figure in the distance, crouched low to the ground. It was humanoid but distorted, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, just watched me. I don't remember running back to camp, but I must have. By the fifth day, I was a mess. My gear felt like a hindrance more than a help, and I was down to my last energy bar. The whispers had grown louder at night, and my maps didn't seem to align with the terrain anymore. I was lost. That evening, as I boiled water over a dwindling fire, I heard a branch snap. I turned and saw it, the figure from before, now closer. Its face, it was my face but wrong, stretched and twisted. "Leave me alone," I shouted, throwing a rock at it. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it mimicked my voice. "Leave me alone." I backed into the tent, clutching my knife like a lifeline. Desperation clawed at me. On the 6th day, I tried to retrace my steps to the edge of the swamp, but every path seemed to loop back to the shrine. I felt trapped, like the swamp itself was conspiring against me. That night, the entity grew bolder. It slashed at my tent, tearing through the fabric like paper. I scrambled out, swinging my knife wildly, but the creature danced just out of reach. It was toying with me. On the final day, I decided I had nothing to lose. I gathered dry branches and doused the shrine in lighter fluid. As the flames roared to life, the swamp seemed to shudder. The entity appeared again, screaming, not a human scream, but a guttural, animalistic roar. It charged at me, its claws slicing across my arm as I stumbled backward. I swung my knife blindly, connecting with something solid. The creature shrieked and disappeared into the shadows. I ran. When I finally emerged from the swamp, I collapsed into the arms of a search and rescue team. I'd missed my check-in by 3 days, and they'd been combing the area. They didn't believe me about the creature. My footage was corrupted, and the photos I'd taken of the shrine were blurred beyond recognition. But sometimes late at night, I hear it, the whisper. My name. The swamp didn't let me go. It just gave me a head start. I thought it was just another quiet shift, but that night in Crooked Pine National Forest, I learned silence is where terror hides. My name is Walt Fraw, and this happened to me in October 1987 in the dense woods of rural Georgia. I've been a deputy sheriff for 13 years, working the kind of small-town beat where your biggest problem is a drunk farmer or a teenager with a lead foot. But Crooked Pine has always been different. Folks around here don't talk about it much, but everyone knows something's wrong with that forest. People vanish out there, not hunters getting lost or hikers going too far off the trail, but entire groups gone without a trace. Animals avoid it too. Deer won't graze, and even the birds stop singing when you get too close. It was late, about 9 p.m. when the call came in. Dispatch said a local hiker named Rory Claiborne had gone missing. His wife hadn't heard from him since morning, and his truck was still parked at the forest's edge. A standard missing person case, except it was Crooked Pine. I pulled into the lot, my headlights slicing through the mist that hung low to the ground. Rory's rusty Ford was there, empty, keys still in the ignition. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and service pistol and set off into the trees. The first mile into the forest seemed normal, quiet, sure, but forests at night are quiet. Then, gradually, the atmosphere shifted. The trees felt closer, their branches gnarled like skeletal fingers clawing at the moonless sky. The air was heavy, damp, and carried a faint sour smell, like something had died and never been found. "Rory," I called, my voice swallowed by the darkness. The beam of my flashlight bounced off trunks and underbrush, revealing nothing but shadows. "Rory Claiborne, it's Deputy Fraw. Call out if you can hear me." Nothing. I kept moving, the unease settling deeper in my gut. Around midnight, I came to a clearing. At its center was a strange formation of stones arranged in a rough circle. They looked ancient, the kind of thing archaeologists would write books about. And there, slumped against one of the stones, was Rory. "Rory." I rushed to him, relieved, until I saw his face. His eyes, not eyes. His face. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his lips torn, his skin stretched taut like he'd been mummified. His hands clutched his chest, and claw marks raked his shirt. Whatever killed him had done so in a frenzy. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat, but before I could process what I was seeing, a sound froze me, a deep, resonant crack, like a tree snapping under its own weight. It came from the woods behind me, followed by a heavy thud. My light darted across the tree line, but there was nothing there. Who's out there? My voice was steady, but my pulse was racing. "This is the sheriff's department." Show yourself. No answer. The sound came again, this time closer, a dragging noise, like something massive being hauled through the undergrowth. My flashlight caught movement, a flicker of pale, grotesque skin slipping behind the trees. It was fast, too fast. I crouched low, drawing my pistol. My breath fogged the air. My training kicked in, and I radioed for backup. The dispatcher's voice crackled in my ear, but the words were broken, garbled. Static swallowed her reply, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. The thing was circling me now, just beyond the light. I caught glimpses. Long, twisted limbs that bent in ways no creature should move. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, covered in patches of coarse, wiry hair. Its face, or what I think was its face, looked stretched, the skin translucent and glistening. No features, just a grotesque suggestion of something that used to be human. "Stay back!" I shouted, firing a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed, but the thing didn't flinch. Instead, it launched into the clearing, its speed terrifying. I barely had time to fire another round before it was on me. The force knocked me back, my head slamming against one of the ancient stones. My vision blurred, pain exploding in my skull. The creature loomed over me, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of jagged, mismatched teeth. Its breath was rancid, hot, suffocating. Instinct took over. I kicked out with both legs, catching it in the torso. It reeled, giving me just enough time to scramble to my feet. My flashlight was shattered, but the moonlight filtering through the trees illuminated its grotesque form. It slashed at me, claws tearing through my uniform and grazing my ribs. Pain shot through me, but adrenaline kept me moving. I fired again, this time aiming for its chest. The bullet struck true, and the thing let out a guttural wet shriek. It staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, it lunged again, faster this time. I ducked, grabbing a jagged rock from the ground. When it came at me again, I drove the rock into its neck, feeling the sickening crunch of cartilage giving way. The creature writhed, its limbs flailing wildly, but I didn't stop. I drove the rock deeper until its movement slowed, then stopped altogether. Its body crumpled to the forest floor, still twitching. I staggered back, my chest heaving, blood dripping from my side. The thing lay motionless, its body already beginning to decay, its flesh sloughing off like wet paper. The stench was unbearable. I limped back to the trailhead, every step agony. When I finally emerged from the forest, backup had arrived. A couple of deputies stared at me, their faces pale. "What the hell happened out there?" one of them asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I led them back to the clearing, to Rory's body and the thing I'd killed. It was still there, its grotesque form a horrifying testament to what I'd faced. They believed me. They had to. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't alone. The night had a stillness that wasn't normal, the kind that made every noise, every creak of the forest, feel like it was crawling up your spine. I had been a trucker for 29 years and had seen all kinds of strange things, but nothing prepared me for what happened out there in the Clouth National Forest, just past the California-Oregon border. My name's El Becker. This happened back in October 1994, and to this day, I still can't wrap my head around it. I was hauling a load of construction supplies from Sacramento to Medford. The route took me through dense forest land, and the winding roads were always a challenge, especially after dark. That night, I decided to pull off at a remote rest stop about 50 miles from Medford. It was a small, tucked-away area with a gravel lot and an old picnic bench, surrounded by trees so tall and thick they swallowed the moonlight. I needed a quick break before tackling the last stretch. As I climbed out of the cab, the air was colder than I expected, biting, even through my flannel. The forest around me felt oppressive, like the trees were leaning in closer than they should. There wasn't a sound. No crickets, no rustle of leaves, just an eerie silence that felt wrong. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired, and walked over to the bench with my thermos of coffee. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like something rotting, but it grew stronger as the wind shifted. It hit me like a punch to the gut, metallic and sickly sweet. I figured it might be a dead deer nearby, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, but then I saw the marks. The gravel lot stretched into the trees, and right where the light from my truck's headlights started to fade, there were strange drag marks in the dirt. They were wide and deep, like something heavy had been pulled through. Beside them, I noticed what looked like claw marks, long, deep gashes that cut through the gravel and into the hard-packed earth beneath. I froze, my coffee halfway to my lips. My first thought was a bear, but the spacing of the claws was wrong, too far apart. Bears didn't drag things like this. The trail led into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. Against every ounce of common sense, I grabbed my flashlight from the truck and followed it. The beam of light wavered as I stepped off the gravel and into the forest. The smell grew stronger, and I had to fight the urge to gag. I moved cautiously, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, but the deeper I went, the softer the ground became, like it had been churned up recently. Then, about 50 yards in, I found it. A mangled deer lay in a small clearing, its body twisted at an unnatural angle. Its chest was torn open, ribs glistening in the dim light, and its head was missing. I felt a wave of nausea and stepped back, nearly tripping over something behind me. When I turned, my stomach dropped. It was another body, not a deer this time, but a man, or what was left of him. His torso was shredded, and his limbs were bent in ways they shouldn't have been. His face was unrecognizable, but his jacket told me he was probably another trucker, one of those independent guys who worked the same routes. A toolbox lay nearby, the metal stained dark and the lid bent as if someone had stomped on it. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it, a sound that wasn't mine, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves. My flashlight flicked toward the noise, and that's when I saw it. It stood at least 7 feet tall, hunched over, its long arms almost dragging the ground. Its skin was dark and leathery, stretched tight over its ribs, and its head, I can only describe it as something between a lizard and a wolf. Its jaws were elongated, filled with teeth that reminded me of a crocodile's. It stared at me, motionless, like it was deciding what to do next. I didn't wait to find out. I bolted back toward my truck, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The thing let out this awful noise, not a growl, but a deep, resonating sound I could feel in my chest. It was coming after me. I could hear its heavy steps crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. I reached the edge of the clearing and spotted my truck through the trees. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. As I reached the gravel lot, I grabbed the tire iron from the side box on the truck. I barely had time to swing around before it was on me. The creature moved fast, faster than anything that size should. It lunged, and I swung the iron with everything I had. The metal connected with a sickening thud, and the thing reeled back, letting out a horrible screech. Its claws lashed out, catching my arm and sending a searing pain through me. Blood dripped down my sleeve, but I didn't let go of the tire iron. I swung again, aiming for its head. This time the blow landed hard and the creature staggered. It wasn't invincible, hurt but not down. It lunged again, pinning me against the side of the truck. Its breath was hot and foul, and I could feel its claws pressing into my shoulder. I jabbed upward with the iron, catching it under the jaw. The creature howled and released me, staggering back. I scrambled into the cab and grabbed the shotgun I kept under the seat. My hands shook as I loaded it, but I managed to rack a shell just as the thing charged again. I fired, the blast echoing through the forest. The creature collapsed to the ground, twitching but not dead. I didn't take any chances. I fired 2 more shots, each one tearing into its chest until it stopped moving. I sat there for a moment, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the stench of the creature, my ears ringing from the blasts. When I was sure it wasn't getting up, I climbed out and took a closer look. Its body was a mess of muscle and scales, with patches of fur in odd places. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before, like it didn't belong in this world. My arm throbbed, but I ignored it as I dragged the thing away from the truck. It was heavier than it looked, and my boots slipped on the gravel, but I managed to pull it off the lot and into the trees. I didn't care to keep it around. I climbed back into the cab, my hands slick with blood, mine and its. I started the engine and pulled out of that lot. not caring if I left the rest stop a mess. I drove straight through to Medford, not stopping until I saw the city lights. I didn't call the cops. What was I supposed to say? There's no way they'd believe me, but I knew what I'd seen. The next day, I dropped the load at the site and went straight to a clinic to get my arm stitched up. The doctor asked what happened, and I told him I got into it with an animal on the road. He didn't press me further. That night, I saw on the news that authorities had found a body at that rest stop. They said it was a trucker who'd gone missing a week earlier. They didn't mention anything about a creature, but I knew it was out there, or at least something like it. My name is Jacob Fisher. I'm 33 years old, and this happened just a few months ago, though it feels like a lifetime. I've been working as a travel nurse for years, moving from city to city, living in the chaos of hospitals and crowded apartments. When I finally took some time off, I decided to embrace solitude. Just me, my RV, and the open road. That's how I ended up in Tate's Hell State Forest in Florida, a place whose name alone should have been a warning. I'd read about the forest's ominous reputation online. Supposedly, it was named after a man, Tate, who wandered the swamp for days under a curse, only to emerge near death and mutter, "My name is Tate, and I've been through hell." Most people dismissed it as folklore, but something about the story intrigued me. It felt like a challenge, a test of my independence and survival skills. I planned to camp there for 3 days, hiking and documenting the experience for my travel blog. I arrived in the late afternoon just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The forest was dense with towering pines and sprawling oaks draped in Spanish moss. The air was thick and humid, buzzing with the constant hum of insects. As I parked my RV at a remote campsite, a park ranger named Mitchell appeared, his orange vest bright against the darkening trees. "You sure you want to stay out here alone?" he asked, his tone friendly but cautious. "Why not?" I replied, trying to sound confident. He shrugged. "It's quiet, that's for sure, but stick to the marked trails. People get lost out here, and some say the swamp doesn't like strangers." I laughed nervously, brushing off his warning. He tipped his hat and left, leaving me alone with the encroaching shadows. As I set up my small campfire, I noticed an older woman standing near the forest entrance. She was watching me intently, her gray hair pulled back in a tight braid. I waved, but she didn't return the gesture. Instead, she called out, her voice carrying an odd weight. "The swamp doesn't forgive the curious," she said, her tone more ominous than I liked. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I told myself she was just a local trying to spook me, but her words lingered as the night deepened. That night, the forest was eerily silent. I'd expected the usual symphony of crickets and frogs, but instead there was a suffocating stillness. As I sat by the fire, I heard faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but unmistakably human. I froze, straining my ears. The whispers grew louder, circling the RV, though I couldn't see anything beyond the firelight. Finally, I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the crackle of the fire. My heart raced as I climbed into the RV, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of a long drive and an overactive mind. But when I woke the next morning, muddy handprints covered the windows, large smeared prints that didn't look entirely human. The next day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The trails were muddy from an overnight storm, and the dense canopy made it hard to tell what time of day it was. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the forest felt. The air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe as though the trees themselves were alive. About an hour in, I found strange wooden symbols hanging from the branches. They looked hand-carved, crude but deliberate. Circles, crosses, and spirals strung up with twine. I snapped a few photos for my blog, but a shiver ran down my spine. It felt wrong, like I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. As I turned to head back, I heard laughter, high-pitched and echoing unnaturally. My stomach clenched. I called out, hoping it was other campers, but no one answered. The laughter faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves as if something was following me. I quickened my pace, refusing to look back. That night, the unease turned to outright terror. As I sat in the RV trying to write about the day's hike, the lights began to flicker. Then the entire vehicle shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. I grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open, but there was nothing there, only the dark, silent forest. As I stepped outside, the air grew colder. I swung the flashlight in every direction, the beam slicing through the darkness. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure stood just beyond the edge of the firelight, tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. Its limbs were too long, its body unnaturally thin, and its head tilted as if studying me. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there watching. Then it began to drift toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it. The figure didn't follow, but I could feel its presence lingering just outside. By morning, I was desperate to leave. I packed up quickly, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, and the dashboard lights flickered uselessly. Frustrated, I grabbed my map and decided to hike to the ranger station for help. The forest seemed even more menacing in the daylight. The wooden symbols I'd seen the day before were now broken, their pieces scattered across the trail. As I pushed deeper into the swamp, the air grew thicker, choking me with the stench of decay. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding me on all sides. Eventually I stumbled upon a clearing where a crude grave marker stood. A wooden cross, weathered and rotting, with a rusted knife embedded in the ground beside it. The whispers grew deafening, swirling around me in an unintelligible chorus. That's when I saw it again. The figure emerged from the shadows, more solid this time. Its face was pale and skeletal, its eyes burning with malevolent light. It raised one spindly arm, pointing directly at me. "I'm sorry," I gasped, though I didn't know what I was apologizing for. The figure tilted its head, as if considering my words, before letting out a low, guttural growl that shook the ground beneath me. Panicked, I grabbed the knife from the grave and held it out like a talisman. The figure recoiled slightly, but didn't retreat. In a desperate bid to escape, I dropped the knife and lit a small fire with the matches I kept in my pack. I hurled burning branches toward the figure, and for the first time it retreated, its form dissolving into the shadows. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I ran. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was beginning to rise. The engine miraculously started on the first try, and I tore out of the forest, not stopping until I reached a crowded rest area miles away. I haven't been back to Tate's Hell, and I don't plan to. I didn't write about the experience in my blog. Some things are too personal or too terrifying to share. But even now, I can't escape the feeling that I didn't leave the forest entirely behind. Last week, I found muddy handprints on my apartment window. I live on the third floor.